how many of you in the audience have had someone like me try to sell you something? Can I get a hand raise? There must be more, come on, honestly. And then I think a few of the others are trying to sell something equivalent. So I'm going to assume there's a reasonable baseline understanding of what I'm talking about. I also want to give you the relief that I'm actually not going to talk about my product for most of this. Instead, I'm going to talk about the movies. And so my next question is, how many of you have seen The Big Short? Can I get another hand raise? Oh wow, that's more than I expected. Okay, well, I'm going to summarize the movie for those that haven't, and for those that have, this is going to sound familiar. So The Big Short is basically a movie about data, really, which is you have a very small amount of real data, and this is mortgages. The actual mortgage document, the actual subprime mortgage document is the real data. And then you have a very large amount of fictitious data. Some of you can probably see where this is going. You have a very large amount of fictitious data based on the very small amount of real data. And as a result, because of this asymmetry, you get a massive market crash. And so the next page that I'm going to show you is where I've sort of summarized the situation in a single chart. I should warn you, by the way, that I spent almost 10 years as a strategy consultant. So this chart may be a little dense for some, but I promise I'll explain it. So this is the chart that I put together. And you can kind of see that at the top, you have this sort of trillions of dollars, I actually tried to Google how many trillions, and it was an insane number of trillions of actual derivatives based on a very, very small amount, comparatively, of actual mortgage data, of actual mortgages. And by the way, this is where it comes back to sustainability. What I then did was I took this very complex chart, and I kind of tried to twist and contort this chart in many different ways to match it to the subject matter for today. And this is sort of what I got. You'll see there's actually not as much twisting and contorting as one might have expected. But at the bottom, well, let's actually start at the top. At the top, you have about 100,000 unique purchases, which is what we work with a lot of large companies. We work with mid-sized companies, some of the ones in this room. And so if you take, like, let's say, a mid-sized business of the sort that many of you might represent or many others might buy from, you have maybe over 100,000 unique purchases, right? So think of a purchase that you buy from a location at a particular time, particular weight, etc. And when you actually look at how most companies are calculating their emissions numbers, and I use emissions as a simplification, but the same will be worse for water, it'll be worse for nature. You have probably less than 5,000 unique emissions factors. There's, in fact, one of the leading databases for food, which I'm not going to name, has about 2,308 unique emissions factors, which might be a bit of a giveaway for those of you who know your databases. And what's interesting is if you look at the Fortune 500 companies using that database, those companies must have many more product variations than that, let alone ingredient variations going into the product. And that leads you to a fairly unique situation, which is, just to give an example, one of these businesses was telling me that they buy edible oil for use in snacks. And actually, there's only one factor that they can use for edible oil. It doesn't matter what type of edible oil they're buying, and it doesn't matter where they're buying it from, there's one simple factor. You start seeing the similarity with that mortgage crisis that we're talking about. But really, this leads to three fairly unique sets of problems for all the companies here. One is that you don't actually make any real progress. And the reason for that is you don't have any real data. All of your emissions measurements are based on proxies. They're all based on fictitious data. They're all based on an LCA taken out of context. You have an organic cotton sample grown somewhere in Costa Rica in a lab being applied to an inorganic cotton actual data set in India. This is to say the least. This is probably one of the better examples. There are much worse examples out there. There's actually no real data, which means that even if you did change your supply chain, even if you did do a lot of the amazing work that we're all out here talking about, it wouldn't actually show up in your numbers, because your numbers are proxies. The second is that you're actually not safe. In fact, you're chronically unsafe, as companies like, well, I won't name any companies, but a very large apparel company last year learned this in the press. Because actually, again, the fact that it's proxy data makes sense to us, because we're the ones, all of us in this room are struggling through the actual calculation headache. But try telling a consumer that you've taken random proxies from a different year out of context. Try telling a random consumer that your emissions calculations are wrong because the spend-based factor you used was in dollars and you're buying in euros and suddenly there was inflation. This is not going to make sense, understandably, to most consumers, so why will you ever actually feel safe with the numbers that you're calculating? And the third is, you have no actual control. And you don't need to be a control freak, you just need to be pragmatic. In a business context, you have to defend your numbers to the board, you have to defend them to your customers, you have to defend them internally. And so if suddenly the emissions factor for sweeteners that you've been using gets raised by 50% without any preamble or any context, and as a result, your painstaking strategy. By the way, how many of you have actually seen a reduction in your scope 3 last calculation versus the one you did before? Can I get a raised hand? 1. Yeah, maybe 2. Most baselines that I've seen have actually registered a 2% increase in the last calculation versus the one before. Remarkably, by the way, 2% is the number I'm seeing multiple times again and again, and I would actually hazard a guess that there's an emissions factor reconciliation that might be part of that. Which means, again, you actually aren't in control of your calculations. You aren't actually in control of your numbers. Those of us who try to actually use a spreadsheet for this feel no more in control because the database is out of our control. And so the sad, scary news, and I promise you this will get better, there is light coming. I will show you the light, I promise. The sad, scary news, though, is that all this is going to get a lot heavier, actually. Anyone who's been following flag guidance, by the way, I was in a room, some of you were in the room with me, a few weeks ago, and we had about 400 million tons of emissions data represented in the room from big food businesses. And there were about, I think, 3 people who actually knew what the flag guidance was and could actually summarize it in a few sentences. But the short of it is, we're going to have to start getting activity-based data and weight-based data for our supply chain. And again, anyone who's been calculating their scope 3 using spend-based proxies, this is going to be a real struggle. And so where does that take you? Where it takes you is you're going to have 2 options, 2 very difficult choices facing you. And there are going to be vendors like me on both sides of that. There's going to be a set of people who look like me, somewhat like me, who are selling you the top-down modeling approach. And these vendors will come to you with a story that says you don't actually need to go out to your supply chain because all of this data exists somewhere. We have scraped the internet, we have run proxies, we have developed the world's leading data models, we have asked ChatGPT, 3, 4, 5, wherever it is, and we have managed to get this data for you, or it's satellite imagery. There's a top-down approach that is, let's call it no-touch. And then there's another set of vendors, another set of individuals coming, also venture funded, who are telling you that actually you don't need to worry because there is one platform to rule them all that they are building. And this platform will be where everyone enters their data. And this will be the single source of everyone's numbers. And so which one do you choose, actually? Can I get who would pick the first one? Can I get a hand raised? One brave soul. Who would pick the second? Okay, 9 or 10. You're right, that's the second one is the one I would also pick in your position. This, by the way, this is, the top half is me, the bottom half is not. But you wouldn't know that from the picture. Anyway, so I would also pick the second one. And the second one I think is what most people would pick. Where does that lead you? It actually leads you here, to this happy place where your suppliers are drowning in surveys. And the reason is that the vendors who are selling you that single platform didn't tell you one secret sacred truth, which is that actually there is also a single platform for packaging. There is also a single platform for logistics. There is also a single platform for farming. There's a single platform for farming of certain types of products, and there's a single platform for soy, and there's a single platform for sugar, and there's a platform for sugar in the global north, and there's a platform for sugar in the global south. And in fact, you end up very quickly with 30, 40, 50 one platforms to rule them all. So you're kind of back where you started. In fact, you're sort of worse than where you started because you have 3 new rabbit holes to figure out. One is that no one's responding to your surveys. Gee whiz, why is that happening? The second is that actually there's no assurance. And you know why? Because everyone trying to sell you this single platform told you, by the way, there's no cost to it. And because there's no cost to it, there's no one actually checking the numbers. So you end up with a really interesting challenge. And you know what that challenge is? Can anyone shout out what the challenge is with no audit or no assurance? Anyone? You get people typing in things like megawatt hours when they mean kilowatt hours, people typing in kgs when they mean grams. You get a lot of farms where actually no one can read. You get a lot of typos, you get a lot of data that's just wrong, some intentionally, some unintentionally. Let's even assume best intentions, you still get errors. Right? So that's actually the problem with no audit and no assurance. And it's the problem because there's something about people coming and selling you snake oil, but I won't go into that. The other piece is that there's actually, again, no change. And you know why there's no change? Is because you've abstracted entirely away from the data. You've outsourced the problem to a third party that has promised you a solution, which means you actually no longer have a connection with the supplier, you no longer have any context for the data you're getting, and you no longer therefore have the ability to actually collaborate. And actually, if you have no ability to collaborate, you're not going to drive any real change anyway. You might have a completed emissions calculation, and you might take comfort from the fact that if it's wrong, everyone else's is wrong in the same way, but actually, you're not going to move the needle. So where's that light that I promised you? The light is that actually, this is going to get a bit easier. And it's going to get a bit easier because of three different drivers. One is that standards are actually settling and they are actually consolidating. All the pain that we're talking about today, all the pain of the different metrics and the different protocols coming in, is actually going to help. We all hate FLAG, let's be honest. Can I get a hand raised who hates FLAG? Anyone? Anyone? At least one. At least one. I think there'll be more when you actually read through the guidance. But it's going to be very painful, trust me. But the good thing is actually that FLAG does set a level playing field because it's going to be painful for everyone in the same way. Everyone is now going to have to start figuring out activities and weights and locations and so on, and that's ultimately a good thing. FLAG is just one example. Every element of standard coming in, while it may be painful now, is going to create shared pain that is ultimately going to raise the bar for everyone. The second aspect is that the tech is going to be interoperable, which means that all of those one platforms are all going to have to be able to speak to each other. And all the different solutions running in tandem are going to have to speak to each other. The honest truth, which the vendors won't tell you, is that the future is interoperable. In the future, no single solution, no single platform is going to win. It is going to have to be many solutions for many different types of players. What works for a small farming business in India is not going to work for a farming business in the UK. What works for logistics is not going to work for packaging. This is the simple truth. And actually, the fact that these will be interoperable will be in everyone's benefit. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then finally, regulation is going to create pools of capital. This sounds nice, but many of the businesses here will feel uncomfortable with it because actually there are only three ways for sustainability to be paid for. One is pass the cost on to the customer. The second is reduce your own margin, hello business. And then the third is efficiencies. And again, the honest truth is that there's only a little bit of efficiency left, right? You can switch to renewable energy. There's a few other areas where you can eke out efficiency. But ultimately, there is going to have to be some financial reckoning. And the only way that that's going to happen, in my opinion, is either industry self-regulation or regulation imposed on industry. But either way, pools of capital will be created, and it'll have to then move backwards into the supply chain to solve the problem, which will increase the willingness and the excitedness of your suppliers to collaborate with you. Let me give you a sneak peek into what this interoperability will look like. And these are visuals from our solution, but this will be true for many others. Maybe just not as nice. What I mean is that you will actually be able to have what I think some of the panelists described, which is the ability for a supplier of yours to push a button and actually have their product environmental data shared with multiple other customers of theirs, which means that they don't have to worry about filling out lots of forms, but at the same time, they don't lose that connection with their customer. And what you also get from the ability to have solutions be interoperable is that their business-sensitive data is protected, but the environmental data is shared onwards, and it is shared with an idea of what the methodology is and an idea of what the underlying activities are. This is not unique to us at Altruistic. For anyone who's familiar with PACT, backed by the WBCSD, there are many large corporations now backing PACT as well, Nestle, Unilever, amongst others in the food space, but then also companies like P&G in personal care. There's increasing momentum behind PACT to support this sort of interoperability of standards. And that I think is part of the light coming at the end of the tunnel. The next is that what you actually start to get, once you can connect up suppliers and customers with real data in real time, is you have the ability to start planning out initiatives and collaborating on real change. Let's be honest, we all want to move past the calculation stage. We all want to actually start moving the needle. And what you need for that is you need this base of real data, and you need the connectivity with companies across the value chain. And so the ability to actually start building out, and what you can see on the chart on the left, is you sort of have a ranked set of interventions with actual abatement cost, which means you can actually take the initiative and you can work out what is the cost to remove a ton of emissions, reduce a ton of emissions using this initiative, and how does it compare to something else? We all know that renewable energy panels, solar panels on the roof of the warehouse is a good thing to do. But who knows whether taking plastic off the mulching on the farm is better than increasing recycled content by 5% in your consumer packaging. These sorts of trade-offs will require better data, better analytics, and better collaboration. And what this means, ultimately, if you really boil it down, is that you get increased accuracy on your actual emissions measurement, that's the first part, and you get an increasingly precise cost of reduction. And the combination of those two things, neither of which we have today, means that you can actually start to correlate CO2 with dollars. And that's something that actually none of us can do today. If you look at any big company filling out its CDP report and putting in the carbon price, that carbon price is literally a finger in the air. In most cases, it's $50. Just saying. And that's because we actually don't know either of these two factors at the top. Once we solve for these, we can actually start to get real correlations. And that will fundamentally change how we think about this ecosystem today. Today, this is the sort of journey we have, right? We have a little company being demanded to send data to the big company, and then we're trying to have the big company think through smacking on a label. When, to be honest, none of us believe that consumers will understand these labels, right? None of us have the real estate on the label to put a label on it, because we're trying to fit 5 different languages on the label. And even if you did put that this packet of milk is 1.2, whatever, like, the consumer isn't gonna understand this, let's be honest. What you actually need is you actually need to switch to a much more nuanced journey, which is where you have data flowing, actually probably flowing both ways. You have finance moving in another direction. You have ecosystem services, which might be insets, it might be something else, flowing in exchange for money and data. And then you have actually a story or a narrative, because you have more visibility, you have more context, which means that you can actually help the consumer solve their real problem, which is how does sustainability tell me more about who I think I am? How does sustainability reinforce my identity? How does sustainability shape who I am as a buyer? That's something that no label will tell you. This does, however, leave you with 3 new problem sets. One is, you're going to need very different contracts with your suppliers. You cannot buy seasonally anymore after this journey, because actually your shift for your suppliers towards regenerative agriculture is probably going to take 5 years at least, which means that you now are going to have to start thinking about longer contracts, more collaborative contracts, different payment terms. You're going to have to start blending in sustainability metrics in with purchasing data in your procurement conversations. None of you are doing that, I know this. Those of you who are actually factoring in ESG into your purchasing are factoring it in as a separate line item, a separate sort of a box tick effectively. Whereas what we really need is to blend it in with the dollars. And the third thing is, and this I think we're also not really prepared for, is the massive upskilling that's going to be needed in how we engage with the supply chain. Right now, it is effectively a zero-sum game, and it has been for 1,000 years. Purchasing has been a zero-sum game for over 1,000 years, where actually, effectively, what I'm giving up as a buyer is what my supplier is getting. And we need to start moving towards win-win. And so actually, this leaves really the trillion-dollar question for all of you in the audience. Are you ready for this? Can I get a shout-out?
Yay.
Oh, come on, that's really, I know it's Monday morning. Come on, one more time.
Yay.
Great, thank you very much.